Hello, I'm back with another Journal With Me video. This one is centered around National Poetry Writing Month, also known as napowrimo, and I'll explain that a bit more as the spread progresses, but I wanted to make a spread for napowrimo before the end of May because National Poetry Writing Month is in April, and I forgot I'd been meaning to make a spread until I sat down a couple days ago and looked at the photos I'd printed out recently and was reminded that I had printed out photos to make a poetry spread and then never did it. So this was me sitting down, finally trying to make that before it was too outdated. So what I first did was sift through all of the little photos I've printed out. I'd printed out a lot recently, which is what I looked through first, and then I just checked through the rest of them to make sure there weren't any others I would want to add. So I started with those and then tried to kind of see what color scheme emerged from the ones that I collected. I had a bit of trouble with this spread in terms of color for a fairly unique reason. Because I wanted to center the spread around the recurring imagery that has shown up in my poetry this month in April. Because in National Poetry Writing Month, people try to write a poem a day. And I love doing it. I've done it every year for the past, 7 years? I'm not sure. A while. I've been doing it for a while, and it's super fun. Definitely has its unique challenges, but it's really rewarding. And by the end of the month, you ideally have 30 poems. If you don't have 30 poems exactly, you have more poems than you would have written if you didn't have the challenge. And one thing that I find really interesting is that because of the process of writing a poem a day in such a short amount of time, themes and images will inevitably start reoccurring. And I find it really interesting because every year I'll look at the poems by the end of the month and notice recurring images and themes that weren't intentional, but are clear that they were things that I was thinking about or images I was using to process things or explore things that have been in my mind a lot. And every year they're very different, which I find really interesting as well. So, all that to say, I knew I wanted this spread to be kind of anchored in the tone of my poetry from this past month, which is a fun guideline to have, but also makes it slightly challenging, because one of my main recurring images in my poetry in April was blood and darkness and light, and shadows, along with some other things. That's actually what the note is in the bottom left corner. I quickly scrolled through my poems and jotted down the main images and themes. But I didn't want the spread to be depressing, and I didn't want it to be dark and intense, because that's not really what my experience was with the poetry process. But I did want it to touch on those images. So, all that to say, I knew I needed to have red in my spread, and for some reason, I always struggle with doing red. I don't really know why, but it just never comes naturally. I'm naturally drawn to a red color palette, so it always feels like it's kind of stretching me out of what I'm naturally drawn to. Which is a good challenge, and it's a fun challenge. It often makes it feel a little bit like a puzzle of like, okay, how can I incorporate these colors in a way that is still visually pleasing to myself personally? So one way that I've really been enjoying making cohesive color schemes is through buttons. A little earlier in the video, I pulled out my boxes of buttons, and I've recently color coordinated them, like color organized them, which is really just satisfying to me personally. And I love picking out buttons that tie in the different pieces of the color scheme, because it is really helpful. You can often find buttons that match a color scheme that might be giving you trouble otherwise. Like, for example, I finally settled on this interesting palette of like kind of a warm red tone and then this like pale bluish green and then this like yellow green, which is not a palette I would go to naturally, but I was really working off of these photos at the top. So by looking for buttons, I was able to find some red buttons and some gold buttons and some like tealish, greenish, bluish ones that all serve as sort of like bridges between the colors in the different photos. So, plus, one reason why I sat down to art journal today was because I just finished organizing my button collection. I was really excited to use them. So that was my plan and my goal was, I want to make a spread using my buttons. So it was very fun and very satisfying to incorporate a handful of them. You will notice maybe that it took me about like the first 5 minutes of this video are me just staring at an empty page. And I wanted to keep that in, even though maybe it's a little visually boring, because that is definitely a lot of my process. I compile all my items that I want to include. I slowly like narrow them down as I try to settle on a cohesive color scheme. And then I kind of just stare at my page and think, and I stare at the things I have on my table and think. And I'm working in my head, but it doesn't really look like I'm doing much. And then finally something will click or something will stand out. For this spread, finding that self-portrait of Van Gogh really helped everything click, because there are a lot of colors in it that are also in the other photos I wanted to include. It has that weird greenish blue, like pale minty color, as well as like the yellower green tones. So I was just really pleased to find it. And once I found that, I kind of had more of a direction of how to put everything together, which was nice, because sometimes if I stare at the blank page too long, I feel a bit stuck. So eventually something will click, and it's just a matter of finding the photo or scrap of paper or little scrapbook element I've been saving that kind of brings the elements together. I knew I wanted to include the actual list of recurring themes and images on the spread, so I loved using this clear paper that I've got saved. It was used as packaging for something I bought a while ago, and I really love using like this semi-translucent paper. I've also used tracing paper in the past for the same effect, so that you can write, but it still shows the bit of the spread underneath. It adds an interactive element, which I'm always trying to include in my spreads. I really like it when they're interactive and there's like something you can flip or open or turn. So it adds that, but it doesn't fully hide whatever's underneath it, which I enjoy. So I'm just filling out the things that I noticed in my poetry this month. It was a weird month of poetry writing for me. I've done this every year long enough to be kind of familiar with my own writing patterns and my own cycles as an artist. I've gotten kind of familiar with what it feels like to be in a period of not much inspiration, or to be in a period of writing a lot but not editing, or to be in a period of editing a lot and not writing as much. But this year was a very strange experience, because I was writing quite consistently, whereas often I'll start out pretty consistent and then start really struggling halfway through the month with coming up with ideas and honestly getting bored of my own writing voice and my own style. I get bored about halfway through. But this year, I really struggled to start. I was super dissatisfied with the first poems I was writing. And then it felt like about halfway through I kind of hit my stride, and that's when I started writing things that felt more expressive and more accurate to kind of the things I'd been processing, or more satisfying at least in how they were articulated, which is pretty opposite from the way it usually happens for me in April's. So that was interesting. It wasn't like worse or anything, it was just new, despite having done this for a handful of years. So I think that's something that's really interesting as a writer and as an artist in multiple ways is that you can become familiar with your own patterns and your own seasons of creativity and rest, but that doesn't mean it's not going to still surprise you. I don't think I'll ever be like fully knowledgeable of my own rhythms, I guess. It does feel like something I'm still continuing to discover, which is fun, even if it can be frustrating sometimes because it means it's not predictable. I think there's a lot of things in art making in general that just can't be predictable, and it kind of stretches me out of my comfort zone, which is definitely good. And that is one thing I enjoy about doing NaPoWriMo every year, is that I never quite know what to expect. Whether that's with how satisfied I am with my work, or with what actually emerges in the poems, or sometimes I end up experimenting in new styles halfway through because I've gotten bored, and that's always fun and also hard to predict how that will go. I might try something and be like, actually I hated that, actually that turned out terrible, well, now I know. Or I'll find a new style that I absolutely love. So I think a lot of it is just trusting the process and being willing to experiment. Experimenting is scary because you can't predict that what comes out of it will be quote-unquote good, but I think letting go of that need for perfection and being willing to just try something is really important. I know it's important for me and my writing practice, and that's another thing I really appreciate about April, is that it doesn't matter if the poem you wrote that day was necessarily good or not. It's just important that you wrote something, and it helps me get out of my perfectionistic mindset that I kind of can get stuck in other times in the year. Sitting in front of an empty page and being like, oh, what if I don't write something good? Well, it doesn't matter, just write something and then you'll have written the poem for the day. And it's more about how all of those poems add up together instead of a single piece. So yeah, at this point I've finished my spread mostly. I've been rambling so much about poetry. But I didn't feel quite satisfied with it. It felt like something was missing. So I decided to go ahead and put away all my stuff to kind of give it a break for a second. And then that's when I realized I wanted to add some little details with markers. I was really struggling to incorporate this like yellowy green color because I don't have any markers that are that color. But I think I made it work despite that by incorporating the red and the gray, and I found this other marker that I like never use. That's a kind of beige, yellowy beige color, which is not quite green enough, but it doesn't not fit, so I think it worked in the end. Plus, with this spread, I knew I wanted to leave a lot of space to write because I want to write about my poetry experience, which is why the things are mostly decorated on the edges. I wanted to keep a lot of blank space in the middle that will then be covered with my written journaling at a later date. So yeah, that is the finished journal, just putting the last bits away. I always forget where my washi tape goes by the time I've taken it out, so it's always a little bit of a puzzle putting it back in, but I always find a place for all of them, even if it takes some work. It was really fun in the end working with a color scheme that I don't think I've honestly ever made a spread with this specific color scheme before. It was quite out of my normal colors, which was a fun challenge and experiment to make. So it was great using the buttons and incorporating all the little tactile elements as well. I'm always a big fan of that. Also, I forgot to say this earlier, but the text in the bottom left page is a quote from a poem that I really love, and I'll link that poem down in the description below, just to give it credit, because it was a poem I came across this April and has really stuck with me, so I wanted to make sure I included that in this spread too. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'm sure I'll be back again with another Journal With Me spread sometime soon.